Hi, and welcome to URP 475. This is the demography review. And this is kind of a interesting topic because globalization and the forces of globalization have had a profound impact on birth rates, fertility rates, migration rates, age structure, basically the characteristics that we use to describe a population of interest. And generally speaking, all of these things are covered under the broad umbrella of demography. So I thought it would be a good idea to actually review some of these concepts. So one, looking at, arguably the biggest impact that globalization has had is that it's really privileged cities over rural areas. So here what you see is the growth of cities. In 1950s, London, Tokyo, and New York were sort of the biggest cities. As we are moving forward here, the bigger cities are increasingly going to be found in developing countries. So in 2015, the biggest cities in terms of population, Delhi, Mumbai, and then Tokyo, of course, is still here. 21 million, 23 million, 36 million. You look at population growth throughout history, and the trend that you see here is that in general, population has actually not grown that much, historically speaking. We didn't really hit our first billion until the mid 1800s. So for most of human history, you had a lot of babies being born and then a lot of deaths, but population not really exploding. Then something happens, right around the Industrial Revolution, and boom, it just takes off. We go from about 1 billion mid 1800s to 7.5 billion or so now, and it's anybody's guess. Well, not anybody's guess, but where this population will sort of top out at. Some demographers believe that it'll top out at 11 billion. That those are estimates based on prevailing fertility rates, or sort of the assumption that fertility rates won't decline in some parts of the world, such as sub-Saharan Africa. Others have a bottom range of about 9 billion or so. So there's a 2 billion spread, right, between the high and the low estimates. So we're not sure, but we are going to keep adding more people, but at some point, human population will start to plateau. If you look at the map of the world, where is the biggest percentage? This is not in absolute numbers. The biggest percentage population change is going to occur in sub-Saharan Africa, right here. If you look at the countries with the most population, today, China, India, of course, at the top. U.S. is also there, right? 300 some odd million people. But as you go to 2050, India, China still remain. U.S. is still there. We're at 400 million. But a whole slew of countries from sub-Saharan Africa, that means below the Sahara, make their way on this list. Nigeria, for example, Congo. Okay, and then Egypt, which is actually north of the Sahara. But you have Bangladesh here, Pakistan, India. These are, if you remember from earlier lectures, South Asian countries in South Asia. So lots of population growth, but it's not uniform. Where else are babies being born? Well, again, Niger, South Sudan. You see, all of these countries on the top list right here are in sub-Saharan Africa. Where are the lowest? South Korea, Romania, Singapore. And you could even put Hong Kong in there if it was a separate country. So some places as many as 7 babies, like Niger, 7.5 babies per woman. In places like South Korea, only 1.2 babies per woman. And 1.2 is too low, frankly, because if you don't have at least around 2 or 2.1, 2.1 is the magic number for developed countries. That's called replacement level fertility. If you don't hit 2.1 per woman, you are not replacing mom and dad, so your population declines. On the other hand, if you hit 7.5, like as in Niger, or 6.7 in South Sudan, you're having too many kids, in the sense that the country itself, family structure, economy cannot support that many kids per woman. So fertility it's not a question of like what is sort of too high or too low. I mean, of course that is a question, but with fertility, what the questions that we really want to ask is whether a country can support the level of population growth that it has. So when you are not producing enough kids, or not allowing immigration to sort of come into your country to replenish kids that are not being born. The U.S., for example, has a fertility rate that hovers around 1.85. It's still not 2.1. However, on the other hand, we are still pretty close to 2. We're not as low as 1.2. If we take our immigrants out in the U.S., our fertility rate drops to, I think, around 1.6 or something like that. So, you want to have enough people that are replacing those who are dying. On the other hand, if you have too many, as is the case right here in many of these sub-Saharan countries, you are not going to be able to develop properly as well because of excess population. This chart looks at, again, population growth by year here, and we added the first billion sometime in 1800s, and then second 130 years later, the third 30 years later, the fourth 15 years later, and so on. Population growth worldwide, trends in population growth worldwide, and what you look at here is, we have 80 million, 87 million, 80s we had a lot of people being added, and that has sort of petered off. So, like, as you add more people, the population growth rate also tends to go down. Growth rate is not the same as absolute numbers. Again, remember that, please, because the world's population is so big now compared to the 80s. The rate is going to be less because in absolute numbers we're only adding 70 million or so. 70 million of, let's say, 7 billion is a lot less than 80 million of 3 billion or so back in the 1980s. Most of this growth, again, is happening in poorer countries, the red part right here, poorer countries. Urbanization, as I mentioned earlier, is happening rapidly throughout the world. Right now, something like half of the world, this should be closer to 51%, half of the world's population lives in a city or an urban area. This is projected to hit like 70% or so by 2050. Again, the question we could be asking ourselves, and we have covered this in one form or another, is why does globalization favor urbanization, right? Why cities, right? That's kind of the question. And we've answered this in a lot of different ways. Cities are basically, where you have, again, multiple markets, not just markets for business and goods, but also markets for things like marriage, market for things like entertainment. You have lots of basically different opportunities that exist in a city that don't exist in rural or semi-urban areas. Also, when you move to cities, you're allowed to specialize and and specialization leads to efficiencies. Efficiencies lead to more goods and services in general, and we generally equate more goods and services with a higher level of welfare in the state. And by welfare, I don't mean like welfare policies. By welfare, I mean quality of life is much higher because you have more goods and services that are being produced, and they're being produced more efficiently. And because efficiencies are higher, the goods and services, the price of these goods and services is falling. So cities allow all of this to really happen. That's why they are favored by globalization, and they are the engines of growth for globalization. That's why in big cities throughout the world, rich or poor countries, people are flocking to cities because cities have job opportunities. They have a better standard of living. Although in developing countries, when many move to cities, often they have to move into slums, and they have to live in squalid or bad conditions, and conditions that were sometimes worse than when they moved in from the rural areas. We will look at this when we look at housing in particular in the next set of lectures. But the short sort of message here is that cities are really they are really the drivers of growth in globalization, and it's the close proximity of labor, which is people, and capital, that is investment, money, and the productive capacity of society, which is embodied in things like factories and whatnot, can be found in urban areas much more so than in rural areas. Rural areas, in contrast, are much more subsistence driven traditionally, meaning that in rural areas, you don't have the same amenities, goods, specialization, people, markets. And in rural areas, people tend to sort of do the things that are necessary for survival and take it upon themselves much more than they would in an urban area. In an urban area, you would work, for example, really hard at your job, make enough money, and then you would basically buy everything else on the market. In a rural area, you might grow your own food a bit more. You might have your own cows. You might be much more self-reliant, which in many ways is actually good. But you, at the same time, won't have access to the goods and services that you do in an urban area. One of the first demographers, if not the first demographer, is Mr. Man by the name of Malthus, Thomas Malthus. And basically, he said, population growth is geometric, food supply growth is arithmetic. Well, and this is a very complicated way of saying is that people don't necessarily grow in a linear way. If a family, husband and wife have two kids, then each of those two kids will produce another two kids, and so on. So the population growth will, Malthus's estimation, far quickly outstrip the ability of the Earth to feed increasing number of people. So what will happen then? Of course, according to Malthus, well, famine, disease, all this stuff will set in, and then people will fight, and population will drop. So he kind of called this something called the Malthusian curve, right? And so you have population growth, and you have the growth of resources, but the people grow, and then famine, wars hit, and then you drop down again. So it kind of goes up and down, kind of like that. But what happened was that Malthus was not really correct, right? Because we have had rapid population growth, right? And if you, again, go back to this chart that we looked at earlier, hit the first billion in 1800s, and now we're, approaching our 8th billion right now. But our ability to feed people has actually gone up. Food productivity has gone up. Agricultural productivity has gone up. So in many ways, the things that he predicted right here about food supply are simply not true. In fact, our poverty rate in the last, even though we still have about 1 billion people, give or take, who live in absolute poverty, as we saw in previous lectures, we are, in terms of the percentage of people living in absolute poverty, it's much less than it was many years ago. So Mr. Malthus had some insight into this, and he was not wrong. The neo-Malthusians, those who still kind of follow this line of thinking, think that, okay, all we have done is sort of pushed the upper limit here, right here. That means we can sustain a lot more population than we thought, but the crash is coming because we have too many people. I'll let you think about that one for a bit. Okay, now let's make a transition here to some key demographic concepts. And these are just sort of an introductory lecture. Oh, this is an introductory lecture to key demographic concepts. Demography itself is a pretty vast topic, and it's big. And I'll give you some links if you want to learn more about it. So counts. What are counts? Basically, it's just the number of something in a given place in a given time period. So we could say 100,000 people visited Disneyland yesterday, right? For example, 100,000 people visited Disneyland yesterday. That would be a count. What's the place? Disneyland. When? Yesterday. Geography and time. Rates. How often something occurs in a population of interest divided by how many people it could have occurred to. So we might say something like birth rate. Well, birth rate. What is the numerator, or the top number? It's the number of babies that were born. Who could have had happened to? Well, women. But in this case, we divide by the total population. So number of babies divided by total population gives you the birth rate. Same thing, we could ask things like accident rate or car accident rate. How would we calculate that? The number of car accidents in a particular area, let's say Pomona or LA County, or the United States, in a given year or a given month or a given day, whatever time period you're interested in. The number of car accidents, total number of car accidents. The total number of car accidents, of course, are counts. But the minute you divide the total number of car accidents by the total number of drivers, who could have gotten into an accident? Theoretically, all drivers could have gotten into an accident. You might get the car accident rate. Okay, so counts and then rates, and then we have ratios. Ratios are basically, you can have ratios between counts, like two sets of counts, or between two sets of rates. For example, we can say the car accident rate in LA County is 1%. That means 1 out of 100 car gets in an accident, let's say, on any given day, which is actually kind of high. And it is kind of high because I don't know the exact statistics. So let's just say 1 in 100. And let's say the accident rate in Orange County is 2 cars per 100, right? So it would be 2%. So LA County 1%, Orange County 2%, 2 in 100. So the ratio of 1 to 2 is what? Well, is 1/2 or 2 to 1, depending on how, which Orange County or LA County is in the numerator. But we could also say that you are twice as likely, on the basis of that ratio, to get into an accident in Orange County versus LA County, right? Why? Because it's 2% in Orange County and 1% in LA County. Some important demographic concepts here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do urge you to read all of them. Age dependency ratio is kind of an important one. It's basically you take the number of people who are not of working age. So who's not of working age? Basically anybody like below 15 or 16 years of age. They're not typically considered part of the labor pool. And to that, you add people who are retired. Who's retired? Typically people over 65. Now, of course, we know people who are 14, 15, 16 who do work. We know people who are 65 who do work. But these are the cutoff categories that we use or numbers that we use. So add the number of people who are below, let's say, 15 and those who are over 64. And then divide by the total number of people who are between 15 and 64. Why? Because that is the working age population. We get the age dependency ratio. Why is this age dependency ratio important? Well, think about it. If you have too many kids and or too many retirees, but not enough people who are working, what happens? Who pays for the pension? The insurance. Basically, the most productive part of society from an economic standpoint are the working age people. When working age people decline in numbers and you have too many old people or not enough kids, the dependency ratio increases. And when the dependency ratio increases, you basically have an unsustainable scenario. Why? Because you don't have enough working age people paying into the system, whether it's insurance, pensions, whatever it is, not paying into the system to support the overall population, right? And so this is kind of what's happening in places like Japan and even China, that because the birth rates are so low, you're not producing enough new people who will eventually become working age people, except life expectancy is getting longer. So people are living longer, they're retiring, but who's supporting them, right? So age dependency in places like China and Japan, South Korea, age dependency, the ratios are becoming lower and lower. So you have too many people who are dependents in places like China and Japan and even South Korea, and not enough people who are of working age. So as the number of people who are dependents goes up, the number of people who are, let's say, over 64 goes up in a place like China, and the number of people who are 15 to 64 goes down because you're not having enough babies. What happens when the numerator gets bigger and the denominator gets lower? You have a dependency ratio that is getting lower and lower over time, and that is not a good thing. Typically, you want something like 4 to 5 working age people for every non-working age person. In places like Japan, this is getting closer to 2 to 3 working age people. Japan actually might even be lower than that. I don't remember off the top of my head right now, but you would get something like 2 to 3 working age people for every one non-working age person. And over time, this is going to get even lower and lower, meaning that a country like Japan, the most serious problem facing a country like Japan then is the age dependency ratio, or the low birth rate or fertility rate, which is causing a decline in the age dependency ratio. So please go over these other terms: age-specific rate, birth rate. We've talked about some of these. Death rate. These are self-explanatory. Dependency ratio again here. Divorce rate, doubling time, ethnicity. Another important concept is fertility. I mentioned this earlier. I'll talk about it a little bit later again. General fertility rate, general reproductive rate, household, immigration rate, and life expectancy. Another important term. I will cover this again. Life expectancy is basically when we talk about life expectancy, sometimes it's confused with average age. They're not the same thing. Life expectancy is basically how many more years can you be expected to live given your age right now. So when we talk about life expectancy in general, we are usually referring to life expectancy at birth. So when we say life expectancy US is around 79, what we're really saying is that a baby born today can be expected to live 79 additional years. But you can have a life expectancy for any age. What is a life expectancy for a person who is 50 years of age in the US? You can look that up in actuarial tables, right? Somebody who's 50 is probably going to live another 30 to 35 years, right? Taking them to an age of 80, 85. A person who's 80 doesn't magically die also, right? I mean, they also have a life expectancy. So if you already made it to 80 80 now is a life expectancy at birth. At birth, in the US, you are expected to live till 79, 80. But if you're already 80, you don't magically pass away. You have maybe a life expectancy of another 5 years, 10 years. That means somebody's already 80 is going to live another 5 to 10 years. They have a life expectancy as well. Life tables, actuarial tables, they show life expectancy and the probability of dying at each age group. These are very important because they're used in things like insurance, pensions, and so on. They're very important because we need to know how much money needs to be put in at a certain age. For example, so you have enough for retirement. How much money the insurers need to charge you so they can adequately price the care for different age groups, right? Healthcare, for example. Most of the payments in the healthcare system are really made by young people. Why? Because young people don't use insurance. Who uses health insurance is the older people, and they are drawing down from the system, whereas the young people are paying in. So now when your age dependency ratios, if you remember this, I covered this earlier, starts to drop, you actually don't have enough young people paying into the system, and it creates a serious problem. It creates insolvency, or a system that is going to go bankrupt. Metropolitan area definition, you can again read this: migration, mortality rate. Mortality rate, another important, it's sort of the opposite or the opposite side of the coin of fertility rate. Fertility rate, babies being born. Mortality rate, people dying. Migration rate, people basically moving into an area. Emigration, or emigration, immigration rate, people moving out of an area. So immigration with an I, people moving into an area. Emigration with an E, people moving out of the area. Nuptiality, population density, momentum, projection. Replacement level fertility, I mentioned this earlier. This is when you have approximately 2.1 kids per couple is usually replacement level fertility. Okay, so when you are looking at in an area, what are some of the basic demographic indicators you should be looking at? Population density, fertility, mortality, immigration, age structure. We'll talk more about age structure in a bit. Race and ethnicity, household size, education achievement, economic indicators, which include gross domestic product, per capita income, which is GDP divided by population, poverty rate. We talked about how poverty is measured in the last few lectures, and so on. So lots of indicators that basically give you not just what the number of people in a given area is, but also like people of different age groups in a particular area. Household size, how much money are they making? How much education do they have? How poor are they? Those kinds of things. Race and ethnicity are pretty important when looking at demographic indicators. More demographic indicators, and I'll let you read these on your own. The next few charts actually look at, for example, literacy throughout the world. It gives you an indication of what I'm trying to do at this stage is sort of give you indicators and give you examples of what these indicators look at different parts of the world. And I'll let you go through these slides on your own because they are pretty self-explanatory here. Okay, let's talk about fertility. I mentioned this earlier, right? What is fertility? Fertility basically is the definition here is average number of children that would be born alive to a woman or a group of women during their lifetime if they were to pass through childbearing years conforming to age-specific fertility rates of a given year. Wow, that's a mouthful. What it really means is that as a woman, let me use this chart to illustrate what I mean, goes through her childbearing years. So childbearing years typically start at 15, and we think they end at 49. Now, of course, women have children, and we've heard of these stories below 15, teenage pregnancies, and over 49, especially now in an era when we have fertility procedures like in vitro fertilization, which are really pushing up the age at which women have children. 40s is not uncommon anymore. Even past 49, we've heard of a few examples. But typically 15 to 49 is sort of the window that we say when a woman's going to have a child. And each of these age ranges, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and so on, you have a probability of having a child. And this is based on where you live. And that's why we say fertility rates are specific to area. So in this case, we are looking at fertility in Israel in 1994. We are calculating Israel's total fertility rate. How do you do this? Well, it's actually a lot simpler than this chart would indicate. You take the total number of women who are between 15 and 19, 244,000. You look at the number of births in this age group, 4,474. You divide column 2, 444.74 by 244,000, you get 0.018. And you multiply that by 5. Why do you multiply that by 5? Because you have 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. You have 5 age ranges in this 15 through 19 group. So you take this and you multiply it by 5 right here. And what do you get? You get basically the fertility, the age-specific birth rate, sorry, for that 15 to 19 age group. You do this for all age groups all the way to 49, right? So you get different numbers here, 0.09, 0.62. You add all these numbers up and you get a number that is 2.88 in this case. What does this 2.88 mean? It means that a woman in Israel in 1994 can be expected to have something like 2.88 children during her lifetime as she goes through 15 through 49, right? So the TFR, total fertility rate in Israel, 1994, 2.88. It means on average, a woman will have 2.88 kids. That's another way of sort of thinking about that, right? Earlier, if you remember, I said the fertility rate in Niger was 7 point something. That means a woman, in Niger could be expected to have 7 kids on average. The fertility rate I mentioned in US was 1.8 something. So a woman in the US can be expected to have 1.85 kids. So you're asking yourself, how can you have 0.8 kids or 0.85 kids? Well, if you multiply 2.88, for example, by 100,000 women, right, you're going to get what? 288,000 kids. That's a whole number, right? Even though the fertility rate itself is a decimal, okay? And more fertility rated terms, general fertility rate, age-specific fertility rate. These are, again, self-explanatory, and so I'll let you read these. One of the questions we can also ask is why are fertility rates actually declining? Not everywhere, right? Because we saw that places like, again, Niger, Somalia, Congo, they were growing up. Why are they going? But in places that are actually becoming middle income and becoming developed, why are they going down? And what are the implications of low fertility rates? I have talked about the implications a little bit already, right? Dependency ratios are going down. Not enough kids to pay into the insurance system, the healthcare system, and so on. And it's actually very bad for the economy in the long run. Your labor pool is shrinking if your fertility rates are too low, if they're below replacement level. Why are they going down? Well, think about it. In many places, kids, initially at least, and historically speaking, kids were a hedge. By hedge, I mean you had kids because kids were like an insurance, right? Insurance didn't exist back in the day, so you had lots of kids to work the farms. They were labor supply. You also had lots of kids because infant and child mortality was high. You had to have lots of kids because not all the kids made it past their adolescence or youth or infancy. You also had a lot of kids because you needed somebody to take care of you as you got older. You also had a lot of kids because you were a woman and you didn't have much say, right? You didn't have much power, and you had to kind of do what your husband or household, extended household, sort of demanded of you, right? You didn't have control over your sexual and reproductive health if you're a woman. But what has happened in the modern era? Women are working more, so maybe they don't, and many women are choosing to have kids later because having children evokes an opportunity cost on their time. Like their career gets stalled a little bit by having children. Childcare is expensive. It's expensive to have kids in a rich country. You have to find childcare. You have to provide for the child. Also, you don't need children to really guarantee or hedge against risk or for insurance because we actually have pension and insurance and all kinds of other things that provide for us that kids used to provide for us. And also, infant and child mortality has gone down, right? And so we don't need to have kids because death rate during infancy, during adolescence, during childhood has gone down dramatically, right? Adolescent, infant, and child mortality has gone down significantly. So all of these reasons combined have caused a decline in fertility rates. Here's some, and this is also happening across the world, right? Kenya, Colombia, South Korea, less so in places like Uganda, but here's some low fertility rates throughout the world, right? As I mentioned, China, Hong Kong, very low. Look at that, 0.94. And then former Soviet countries. It's kind of weird, right? China and then all the former Soviet countries and then Korea. Makes you wonder, why are the former Soviet countries having low fertility? Some places low fertility, some places high fertility, diverging trends in fertility reduction. Okay, what's the opposite of fertility? Mortality. Babies being born, people dying, mortality. We can measure mortality rate, general number of people who, number of deaths divided by who could have died. Everybody can die, total population. What is K here? I note that K, and this was also in the fertility birth rate charts, K is a constant such as 10,000, 100,000, and we multiply the rates by. So we can say things like 1 in 10,000, 2 in 10,000, right? So take total number of deaths, divide by total population, you're going to get a very small decimal. But once you multiply it by 10,000, 100,000, you'll get a much bigger number, a whole number, maybe even. Okay. We talked about life expectancy earlier, but just again briefly, it's the average number of additional years a person could be expected to live if the age-specific death rates for a given year prevailed for the rest of his life. So again, the key take-home message here, that life expectancies are there for every age, not just at birth, right? And although at birth is the one that is most commonly cited in the US, that's around 79 today. Though men live less than women. Women live slightly more than men. Men are around 77. Women are actually closer to 80, 81 in the US. These are different life expectancies in different regions on the planet. It's gone up everywhere. Oldest countries in the world. This is kind of interesting, right? I told you, right? Japan, not enough babies, lots of old people. Italy, Germany, mostly rich countries, and then some also Eastern European countries, former Soviet countries. Why they're not having babies, as we saw in the previous chart, they're not really having that many kids, but they also have pretty good life expectancy. So people are living long, not many kids, right? But these countries are old, and if they're not going to replace the young people and the middle-aged people who are currently existing, you're in serious trouble. But who's going to support the insurance, health, pension burdens that are associated with the aging of the population? Earlier, I mentioned a concept called age structure. This is also related to dependency ratio. Age structure basically is the population pyramid. It tells us how many people do you have in each age range. So a developing country, a more poor country, tends to look like a typical pyramid like this. Lots of babies in the middle, some working age, and very few older people. Because why? They don't have healthcare is not as good, nutrition is not as good, and so on. And so you don't have that many older people, right? You have lots of babies, high fertility rate. So this would be like somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. You would see this population pyramid. In developed regions, you would see more people of sort of in the middle, the working ages, not many babies being born, and increasingly more and more old people, right? Here the base is the same. You see that this is 100, 200, 300 million, 100, 200, 300 million, and so on. But in developed regions, you not only have fewer people, but the age structure. This is a traditional pyramid, looks very different. This looks like kind of like a barrel, like small at the bottom, kind of bulging in the middle, and then smaller at top. Eventually, this becomes an inverted pyramid in places like Japan. It almost flips. This flips backwards. You have lots of old people and very few younger people in places like Japan with low fertility rate. More examples of population pyramids. This is US. This is what ours looks like. And if you notice here at top, this is not women. You notice how many more women we have that are older than men in the same age, 80 plus, right? Because women outlive men. We still have a pretty good fertility rate, but it's still not as much as, let's say, Democratic Republic of Congo. Lots of babies, not many older people, few working age. We're kind of evenly split between babies and working age. But in a very slow growth country like Germany, this pyramid is starting to invert, become sort of backwards. Japan is kind of the same, as I mentioned earlier. This is China. China, 1950s, developing country. 2000, starting to look like the US. 2050, kind of like a big rectangle, right? I was telling you, they are not having enough kids. Aging in China. It's getting older. Same message. Dependency ratio, again. Ratio of workers to dependence by region. You can look at that. Right? Changes in dependency ratio. Okay, another important concept we mentioned earlier when we were looking at the list of definitions is called demographic transition. And basically, the theory here is that every country or region goes through these stages of demographic transition. What are they? Pre-industrial stage, when they don't have industrialization. You have lots of babies, but you also have lots of death. Lots of babies, lots of death. What does that mean? Population does not grow. Then you kind of transition into a pre-industrial, industrial stage right here. And you have better public health, better economy, better healthcare, so on. Birth rate still stays about the same. People are still having lots of kids, but what happens to death rate? It drops a lot. As soon as the birth rate stays the same, death rate drops. What do you have? You have massive population increase. This is where some of the poorer countries are right now, this middle stage. Then what happens? All of a sudden, you're like, people become richer. They don't want to have as many kids. You can see this in the U.S., right? There's lots of folks who reject, I don't want to have kids ever. Birth rate really drops. Death rate is still low. And then what happens? Sometimes death rate exceeds birth rate. It kind of does this funny thing in the end. This is the post-industrial stage, and you have very slow population growth or negative population growth, right? Pre-industrial stage, post-industrial stage look kind of similar, right? Very low population growth or none at all. Low population growth or none at all. But the real boom happens in this transitional industrial stage. This is called the theory of demographic transition. This next chart is kind of the same chart. It gives you a bit more information on this. Important concept here is natural increase. Natural increase refers to increase not by immigration, but by babies. California, for example, we add something like 300,000 to 400,000 people a year, give or take. But most of this is because of natural increase. We actually lose, in California, we lose people to surrounding states. And we do have immigration from outside the state, like outside the country. But most of the population increase in California is due to the babies being born in California, and that is natural increase. Okay, the last piece of this, migration. So what is migration? Well, I mean, pretty self-explanatory, right? Movement of people from one area to another. Earlier I mentioned immigration when people move into an area, immigration when people move out of an area. Globalization has caused a lot of rural to urban migration. Why? Again, because cities are ideally poised to benefit from globalization, and cities feed globalization. Cities are the engines of growth of globalization. Lots of markets, lots of jobs, lots of specialization, right, in cities compared to rural areas. Again, you have trends in urbanization. We looked at this earlier. Central America, an example. It's happening everywhere throughout the world, urbanization, because of people moving from rural to urban areas. A lot of people move. They move for lots of reasons, right? Business, of course, is the biggest one, right? For jobs. So economies are favoring urban areas. But also people move because of rural areas are losing resources. They're not being developed. They don't have the same ability to provide for their people as urban areas. Resources are being depleted. People also move because they're forced to move. There's war, there's famine, there's desertification, there's climatic reasons, environmental change. Lots of reasons for migration. All of these together, however, in the end favor cities, right? Favor cities. Okay, these charts look at global migration trends, and I'll let you read these. But in general, what this chart says, number of international migrants, people living outside their country of birth, has reached an all-time high. So migration is not only between urban and rural areas, right here, as we were saying, urban and rural areas, but it's also between countries. People are moving within countries. People are moving from rural areas to urban areas, but people are also moving between countries. And this chart looks at that. Right? The three different revolutions with respect to the past 100, 150 years or so. 1800s, the big revolution was communications, right? We had the telegraph, right, for example. Then we had in our first telephone lines laid down. And then transportation, right? People started ships, and this actually started even earlier, and then planes. And now we have human rights. These revolutions are happening. And why are rights actually important in the context of globalization? Think about this. Because in the absence of rights, workers don't have rights, contracts are not enforced, democracies are not sustained. And when you can't guarantee rights, you also can't guarantee the stability that is required to make the global economy work. So this is essential, actually, the rise of law, order, and human rights, and sort of playing by the rules to make the economy work. Regional migration trends again. Africa, North and South America. Again, you can read about these kind of interesting statistics here. Europe, Asia, Middle East, and then Oceania and the Pacific. This is Australia. So again, the short story here is that, or the long story, or the summary here, if there is one in demography, it's that uh, the globalizing economy has caused profound shifts in demographic patterns, and as countries have become richer, they have started having less kids. People are living longer, so quality of life has gone higher. On the other hand, number of babies has fallen, which creates problems. People are also moving between places, unlike ever before, from rural to urban areas in countries. So cities are becoming very important. You have these mega cities in developing countries as people are pouring in from the countryside. In many cases, these cities are unprepared, basically, for the onslaught of migrants. So you have lots of slums, lots of really dire conditions in developing countries. And then when people can, they're moving between countries for job opportunities, right? And you can see that. I mean, one of the backlashes we have had in recent times in the U.S. in 2017, 2018 is the backlash against migration, right? Our current administration, the Trump administration, has made prioritizing, America first, American jobs first, jobs for American people over outsourcing of jobs or bringing in migrants in from, for example, using H-1B visas to fill in jobs in the U.S. And the argument is that why don't we give jobs to people who are in the U.S. first and not to people who are migrating in from other places or coming in for work using temporary work visas. And we can all react to it one way or the other. These kinds of questions tend to evoke strong feelings. On the other hand, we also there's a way of looking at this and saying, okay, what are the pros and cons of different ways of approaching this, and what are we actually hoping to accomplish? There are good arguments on both sides. There's something to be said about protecting American jobs because what are we doing? Companies are getting richer by hiring cheaper labor, but that richness is not necessarily trickling down to the American working class. On the other hand, you could also kind of ask yourself, maybe workers in other countries also have a right, to earn better wages by working in outsourced jobs or even coming to America on temporary work visas. It's a complicated question, but it's one that's not going anywhere, and I don't think it's one that's going to be solved by countries putting up, metaphorically and literally, bigger and bigger barriers or bigger walls. Okay, so I hope you have. This is a primer on demography. It is absolutely essential to understanding what is happening in the world today. Demographic change is happening because of globalization, and it's also demographic change is also helping globalization, or in some cases, not helping globalization. And I hope some of these things are clearer to you now after the end of this lecture. More to come.